February 21st, 2025, 9:58 in the morning. A Virgin Australia pilot flying over the Tasman Sea gets an emergency radio call from the Chinese Navy. What they said next forced 49 commercial flights to suddenly change course mid-air, diverted thousands of passengers, and exposed a terrifying gap in America's Pacific defense strategy that no one is talking about. By the end of this video, you'll understand why China just made one of the boldest military moves in the Pacific in decades, why Australia and New Zealand are scrambling behind closed doors, and what this means for you if you've ever flown over the Pacific. Because what happened next? It wasn't just a military drill. It was a calculated message that changed everything. Stay with me. Let me paint the picture. 3 Chinese warships. Not just any warships. We're talking about the Type 055 destroyer Jinyi, one of the most advanced and lethal warships on Earth with capabilities that rival, and in some cases exceed, American Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. The Type 054A frigate Hingyang, and a massive Type 903 replenishment ship Weishenhu. These vessels quietly sailed through the Tasman Sea, the liquid highway between Australia and New Zealand, 2 of America's closest Pacific allies. They positioned themselves 346 nautical miles east of Eden, New South Wales, right in the middle of one of the world's busiest international flight corridors. And here's where it gets absolutely insane. At 9:30 in the morning, they began live-fire exercises. Naval guns hot, combat drills. In international waters, yes, but with barely any warning. The Australian Defence Force, with all its multi-billion-dollar radar systems, satellite networks, and intelligence apparatus, didn't know the guns were firing until 40 minutes after the drills had already begun. And how did they find out? Not through military channels, not through intelligence networks. A civilian pilot on a routine morning flight radioed it in at 9:58 a.m. 40 minutes late to their own backyard. Standard international protocol for live-fire exercises near commercial air routes. 24 to 48 hours minimum advance notice. China gave essentially none. Qantas flights. Virgin Australia. Emirates. Air New Zealand. Singapore Airlines. 49 aircraft carrying thousands of passengers, all suddenly diverted mid-flight. Pilots were confused. Air traffic controllers were blindsided. Passengers had absolutely no idea why their flights were suddenly changing course, adding hours to their journeys. But here's what makes this even more calculated. This wasn't a one-time event. The very next day, Saturday, February 22nd, they did it again. A second live-fire exercise. From 9:30 a.m. to 2 p.m. Main naval guns firing. Target practice. Combat readiness drills. Right there, 350 nautical miles northeast of the Bay Strait, between Australia and New Zealand. The Royal New Zealand Navy's frigate, HMS Est Kaha, was close enough to observe the Chinese destroyer Jinyi firing its main gun. They watched as the Chinese warships changed formation, deployed targets into the water, conducted combat maneuvers, and recovered the targets. And then they did something no Chinese naval task force has ever done before in recorded history. They circumnavigated the entire Australian continent. Think about what that means. China sailed 3 warships, a modern destroyer, a frigate, and a supply vessel, completely around Australia. Through the Tasman Sea, past New Zealand, down past Tasmania, through the Great Australian Bight along the southern coast, up the western coast, right past Perth, home to HMS Sterling, one of Australia's most sensitive submarine bases. Then north toward Christmas Island and back to the South China Sea via Indonesia's Sunda Strait. Over 2 weeks, 16 days of operations, from February 18th through March 9th. The Australian Defence Force and New Zealand Defence Force tracked them the entire way, shadowing them, monitoring them, unable to do anything about it because, and here's the genius of it, Everything China did was completely 100% legal under international maritime law. This wasn't just a show of force. This was a masterclass in strategic messaging. Now here's what the mainstream media isn't connecting for you. And this is where the story gets really interesting. Remember back in September 2024, when New Zealand sent the HMS Aotearoa through the Taiwan Strait alongside an Australian destroyer? That freedom of navigation operation that was supposed to send a message to Beijing? That was the first time since 2017 that New Zealand had sailed through the Taiwan Strait. China didn't forget. Remember when Australian warships conducted freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea throughout 2024, and in one incident were confronted and shadowed by 7 Chinese warships? When a Chinese fighter jet released flares within 30 meters of an Australian P-8 Poseidon surveillance plane over the South China Sea in February 2025, just days before these exercises, China definitely didn't forget that. This Tasman Sea operation, this was strategic payback, calculated, perfectly legal, and brilliantly executed payback. Because here's what's really happening on the geopolitical chessboard. China just proved 4 critical things in one operation. 1. They can project naval power anywhere in the Pacific, anytime they want, with almost no advance warning. The days of assuming our neighborhood is safe are over. 2. They can disrupt critical civilian infrastructure, international flight routes, commercial shipping lanes, tourism, business travel, whenever they choose, and there's nothing Australia or New Zealand can do about it legally because it's happening in international waters. 3. They exposed a massive intelligence gap. If China can move 3 warships into the Tasman Sea, conduct multiple live-fire exercises just 640 kilometers from the Australian coast, and circumnavigate the entire continent before military intelligence even knows what's happening, what else are they doing that we don't know about? What submarines are lurking that we can't detect? 4. They sent an unmistakable message about AUKUS. AUKUS, the trilateral security pact between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, was signed in 2021. It's designed to counter Chinese influence in the Pacific. Australia is getting nuclear-powered submarines as part of the deal. China has repeatedly condemned AUKUS as Cold War thinking that will fuel military confrontation. And when Australia and New Zealand conduct freedom of navigation operations near China, they justify it by citing international law and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So China just used that exact same legal framework, freedom of navigation in international waters, to conduct military exercises right in Australia and New Zealand's backyard. The Chinese ambassador to Australia, Xiao Qian, said it perfectly during an ABC News interview on February 28th. Quote, "I don't see there's any reason why the Chinese side should feel sorry about that, or even to think about to apologize for that. As a major power in this region, it is normal for China to send their vessels to different parts of the region to conduct various kinds of activities." China just turned Australia's own strategy against them. Now here's what's truly terrifying, and this is what keeps defense officials awake at night. Where was the United States during all of this? America's Pacific pivot, the 7th Fleet? Near silence. No major naval response. No joint exercises immediately announced with Australia. No carrier strike group deployment to the region. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Midget was docked in Sydney for a public relations visit while Chinese warships were conducting live-fire drills just a few hundred miles away. A U.S. nuclear submarine, the USS Minnesota, did arrive at a Western Australian port on February 26th, but that was a scheduled visit, not a response. Australia's Defence Minister Richard Marles lodged a formal complaint through diplomatic channels in Canberra and Beijing. He called China's response unsatisfactory. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese confirmed diplomatic warnings were issued. But substantive American action? Crickets. And that silence is what has defense officials in Canberra and Wellington genuinely concerned. Because everyone in the Pacific is asking the same question right now. If China can do this with impunity, what stops them from doing more? And the story gets even more chilling. Australian Admiral David Johnston, Vice Chief of the Defense Force, told the Senate something that should make your blood run cold. He stated that a Chinese nuclear attack submarine could have been accompanying Task Group 107 the entire time. They never detected it, never confirmed it. But based on intelligence patterns and operational doctrine, it couldn't be ruled out. It could have been there, somewhere beneath the surface. Silent, tracking, watching. Meanwhile, New Zealand's Defense Minister Judith Collins publicly called this the most significant and sophisticated Chinese naval operation ever seen in the region. Think about what that means. Not just unusual, not just concerning. The most significant and sophisticated operation ever witnessed in these waters. And remember, every single action China took was completely legal under international maritime law. They operated in international waters. They followed the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. They technically issued safety warnings, even if the timing was absurdly inadequate. That's what makes this so brilliant and so dangerous. China just wrote a new playbook for gray zone warfare. So what does this mean moving forward? Australia and New Zealand are now reassessing their entire defense posture. In August 2025, 5 months after this incident, both nations announced their deepening military cooperation and intelligence sharing specifically because of these Chinese exercises. New Zealand is being pressured to reconsider its position on AUKUS. For years, Wellington has maintained a nuclear-free policy and stayed outside the pact. But after February, that conversation is changing rapidly. Commercial airlines have completely revised their flight planning procedures for the Tasman Sea corridor. They're now factoring in potential military activity zones that didn't exist before. And China? They've demonstrated they can turn one of the world's busiest airspaces into a combat training zone whenever they want, with minimal notice, and face virtually no consequences. This wasn't just about 3 warships. This was about redrawing the psychological map of who controls the Pacific. So here's what you need to understand. The Pacific is no longer a stable region. The assumptions that have governed air travel, maritime commerce, and regional security for 70 years since World War II are being rewritten in real time. February 2025 marked a turning point. A line was crossed, and the response, or lack thereof, from the United States has every ally in the region questioning what America's security guarantees actually mean in 2026. If you found this video eye-opening, hit that subscribe button because we're tracking these Pacific power shifts every single week. Drop a comment below. Do you think Australia should join AUKUS fully? Or is that going to escalate tensions even more? I'm reading every single one. And if you want to understand what happens next in this Pacific chess match, check out the video I've linked in the description about China's aircraft carrier deployments and what they mean for Taiwan. The Tasman Sea incident? That was just the opening move. What comes next will determine the balance of power in the Pacific for the next 50 years. Thanks for watching. Stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.